"Either you work, or you're out on the street," my daughter said, standing at the head of the dining table, like she was delivering a business decision instead of speaking to her own mother. And I remember how quiet the room felt in that moment, how the soft hum of the refrigerator seemed louder than her voice, how my hand stayed perfectly still on my plate, as if any movement might shatter what little dignity I had left. And I didn't argue. I didn't ask her to repeat herself. I didn't remind her that just 7 days earlier I had buried her father after 43 years of marriage. I simply nodded, folded my napkin with careful precision, and stood up from the table as though nothing had happened, as though my world hadn't just shifted beneath my feet. Because there is a particular kind of silence a woman learns over time, the kind that protects what remains of her pride when everything else is being taken away. And that night, I carried that silence with me up the stairs, past the framed family photos that suddenly felt like artifacts from someone else's life, into the bedroom that still smelled faintly of Daniel's cologne, where his watch sat untouched on the nightstand exactly where he had left it. And I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time without turning on the lights, listening to the unfamiliar emptiness of a house that no longer felt like mine, replaying her words not with anger, but with a strange, quiet clarity, because something about the way she said it, so certain, so prepared, told me this hadn't been a moment of frustration. It had been a decision, and decisions like that don't appear overnight. They are built slowly, carefully, in conversations you are not part of, in plans you are never meant to see. And for the first time since Daniel passed, I felt something shift inside me, not grief, not even sadness, but awareness. The kind that settles in your chest and refuses to be ignored. And the next morning, when the sunlight came through the kitchen window exactly the way it always had, I made my coffee, sat at the table, and looked around at the space I had spent decades building, maintaining, protecting, and I realized I had a choice, not the one she gave me, but my own. And instead of packing my things, instead of calling a realtor or searching for apartments I couldn't afford, I picked up my purse, took out a small envelope Daniel had once handed me with a quiet, "just in case," and I walked out the front door without a word, got into my car, and drove somewhere my daughter never imagined I would go. Because if there was one thing my husband had always been, it was careful. And if there was one thing I had learned from him, it was this: never assume you understand everything just because someone wants you to believe you do. The drive to the bank felt longer than it ever had before, even though it was the same 10 minutes down Maple Street I had taken for years, the same stoplight that always stayed red just a little too long, the same gas station on the corner where Daniel used to insist on checking the tire pressure every Sunday morning. But everything looked different now, not because the town had changed, but because I had. Because for the first time, I was not just going through the motions of a routine errand. I was following a thread I did not fully understand, something quiet but persistent that had taken root the moment Chloe spoke those words. And as I parked outside the bank, I sat in the car for a few seconds longer than necessary, my hands resting on the steering wheel, steady but colder than usual, reminding myself that I was not here to prove anything to anyone. I was here to understand. And that distinction mattered more than I realized at the time, because understanding has a way of shifting the ground beneath you in ways you cannot undo. And when I finally stepped inside, the air conditioning brushed against my skin with that familiar sterile chill, the scent of polished floors and paper and quiet conversations surrounding me. And I approached the counter with the same polite smile I had worn for decades, the one that said I did not want to be a bother, the one that had gotten me through more situations than I could count. But today it felt different, not weaker, just more deliberate, as I asked to speak with someone about my accounts. And when the young man behind the counter directed me to a small office near the back, I followed him without hesitation, taking a seat across from a woman who introduced herself as Karen, her tone professional, but kind in a way that suggested she had seen people like me before, people who walked in unsure and left with something they had not expected. And as she began typing on her computer, asking for my identification, confirming details I barely remembered providing years ago, I watched the screen reflected faintly in her glasses, numbers and lines, moving in ways that meant nothing to me yet, until suddenly her expression shifted, not dramatically, just a slight pause, a flicker of something that made her sit up a little straighter, and she turned the monitor slightly toward herself as if to double-check what she was seeing. And in that small, almost invisible movement, I felt it, that quiet certainty returning, the same one that had led me here. And after a moment she looked back at me, her voice careful now, measured, as though choosing each word with intention. And she said, "Mrs. Harper, when was the last time you reviewed all of your accounts?" And I answered honestly, telling her that my husband had always handled those things, that I trusted him completely, that I had never felt the need to question it. And she nodded slowly, her fingers moving again across the keyboard before she printed out several pages and placed them neatly on the desk between us. And I remember how the paper looked so ordinary, just ink on white sheets, nothing dramatic, nothing that should have felt like a turning point. And yet when she spoke again, her voice slightly softer but unmistakably clear, everything around me seemed to still, as if even the quiet hum of the bank had paused to listen. "Mrs. Harper, you are listed as the primary owner on multiple accounts, including a trust that has been actively maintained for several years." And for a moment I did not respond. Not because I did not understand the words, but because I understood them too well. And in that instant, sitting in that small office with those papers in front of me, I realized something that my daughter had not, something she had never even considered. And it was not just about money. It was about control, about intention, about a man who had seen something coming long before I ever did, and had quietly made sure I would never be as powerless as I had been made to feel just the night before. Karen did not rush me, and I appreciated that more than I could explain, because there are moments in life when speed feels like pressure, and pressure makes people miss what matters, and I had already missed enough without even knowing it. So I leaned forward slightly, my eyes moving over the pages she had placed in front of me, numbers arranged in neat columns, account names I did not recognize, balances that felt almost unreal. And yet there they were, printed in plain black ink, undeniable and precise. And I traced one line with my finger as if touching it might make it clearer. But clarity was not the issue. Acceptance was, because nothing about this matched the version of reality I had been living in, the version where I was dependent, where I needed to be told what to do, where I was quietly being pushed out of a life I thought I still belonged to. And Karen's voice broke through my thoughts again, calm and steady, explaining that the trust had been established several years ago, that it had been consistently funded, that it was structured in a way that gave me full authority, not shared, not conditional, but full. And I nodded slowly as she spoke, not interrupting, not asking questions right away, because something else was happening beneath the surface of that conversation, something quieter but far more important, pieces of memory beginning to align in ways they never had before, small moments with Daniel that had once seemed insignificant now returning with a different weight. The afternoon he had asked me to sign a set of documents while we were updating our insurance, the way he had insisted on handling certain calls himself, the occasional comments about planning ahead, about making sure things were simple for me later, and I had trusted him completely, never questioning, never needing to, because that was what our marriage had been built on. Trust that did not demand explanation, and now I understood that what he had really been building was not just security, it was protection, not from the world outside, but from something much closer, something he had seen before I did, and I felt a shift inside me, not dramatic, not loud, but firm, like a door closing quietly behind a decision already made. And I asked Karen a single question, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me. I asked her who else had access to these accounts, and she looked at me directly before answering. "No one without your authorization, Mrs. Harper." And that answer settled something deep in my chest, because it meant the truth was simpler than I expected. There was no shared control, no hidden oversight, no quiet arrangement that left me exposed. There was only me. And for a moment I sat there in that small office, holding that realization, feeling it take shape. And I thought about the night before, about Chloe standing there with such certainty, such confidence in her position. And I realized that her confidence had not come from knowledge. It had come from assumption, an assumption that I was exactly who she believed me to be. Someone without options, someone without leverage, someone who could be moved out of the way without consequence. And the quietest part of all of this, the part that mattered most, was that she was wrong, completely and entirely wrong. And as I gathered the papers Karen had given me, placing them carefully into my purse, I did not feel anger. I did not feel the need to confront or correct or explain, because those things belong to people who need to be understood. And for the first time in a very long time, I did not need that. I only needed to decide what to do. Next, and that decision, I realized as I stood up and thanked Karen, would not be made in a moment of reaction. It would be made with the same quiet care Daniel had used all along, one step at a time, without announcing it, without giving anyone the chance to interfere, because sometimes the strongest position is the one no one sees coming. When I stepped out of the bank, the sunlight felt different against my skin, not warmer, not brighter, just clearer, as if something had been removed from between me and the world. And I sat in my car for a moment longer than before, my purse resting on my lap with those papers inside, heavier now not because of their weight, but because of what they represented, and I found myself thinking back to the last few years, to the small moments that had once slipped past me without question, moments that now returned with a quiet insistence, asking to be seen differently. And I remembered how Chloe had started offering to help with things after Daniel retired, how she would suggest organizing paperwork, simplifying accounts, making things easier for me. Her tone always gentle, always reasonable, never demanding, and I had accepted it because it sounded like care, because it felt like something a daughter would naturally do. But now, sitting there with the truth laid out in neat printed lines, I could see the pattern that had been there all along, not loud, not obvious, but consistent, a slow shift in control disguised as concern. And I thought about the evenings when Daniel would grow quiet after Chloe left, the way he would linger at the kitchen table a little longer, his fingers tapping lightly against the wood as if working through something in his mind, and how he would sometimes look at me with that steady, thoughtful expression before saying something simple like, "You should always know where things stand, Evelyn." And I would smile, brushing it off, telling him that I trusted him, that I did not need to worry about those things, and he would nod. But there was always a pause after, a pause I never understood until now, because trust, I realized, had never been the issue. It was awareness, and Daniel had been trying, in his own quiet way, to give me something I had not thought I needed, the ability to stand without relying on anyone else's interpretation of my life. And as I turned the key in the ignition, I felt that understanding settle into something steadier, something that did not rush or demand immediate action, but instead shaped the way I would move forward from this point on. And I did not drive home right away, not because I was avoiding it, but because I wanted to think without interruption, to let each piece fall into place without being influenced by the environment I had just stepped out of. And I drove slowly through streets that had not changed but somehow felt unfamiliar, noticing details I had not paid attention to before, the way people moved with purpose, the way life continued without hesitation, and it occurred to me that I had been standing still in ways I had not recognized, allowing others to define my position without ever questioning it. And that realization did not make me angry, it made me precise, because anger can cloud judgment, but precision sharpens it. And by the time I finally turned toward home, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I was not going back as the same person who had walked out the night before. I was going back with knowledge, and knowledge, when held quietly and used carefully, has a way of changing everything without needing to announce itself at all. When I pulled into the driveway, nothing looked out of place. The same porch lights still on from the night before, the same curtains drawn halfway in the living room window, the same quiet suburban street that had always felt predictable, safe even. And yet as I stepped out of the car, I realized that predictability had never meant control. It had only meant routine. And routine can be broken the moment someone decides you no longer belong in it. And I walked to the front door, unlocked it, and stepped inside without making a sound, not because I was trying to hide, but because I wanted to observe, to see what had changed without announcing my presence. And it did not take long to notice. The mail had been moved from the entry table to the kitchen counter, a small detail, but not one I had done. A stack of envelopes slightly shifted, as if someone had sorted through them, and I set my purse down quietly, taking out the papers from the bank and placing them flat against the surface, smoothing them once with my hand, not out of habit, but out of intention, because these were not just documents. They were clarity, and clarity has a way of steadying even the most uncertain steps. And I could hear Chloe upstairs, her voice faint through the ceiling, talking on the phone in that same controlled tone she used when she believed she was handling something important. And I listened for a moment, not to catch words, but to understand rhythm. And there it was again, that confidence, that assumption of authority, and I realized then that nothing had changed for her. Not yet. She still believed the version of events she had constructed, the one where I would quietly pack my belongings, where I would accept her terms, where I would step out of a life I had helped build without question, and I felt no urgency to correct that belief, because correction requires confrontation, and confrontation reveals position, and I was not ready to reveal mine, not when silence was still giving me more information than any argument ever could, and instead I moved through the house slowly, deliberately, noticing things I had once overlooked, the file cabinet in the hallway slightly ajar, a folder inside labeled with my name in Chloe's handwriting, the kind of detail that would have once felt helpful, organized, thoughtful even, but now carried a different weight, a quiet implication of control, of preparation, of plans made without me. And I closed the drawer gently, not disturbed, not surprised, just aware, and awareness, I was beginning to understand, was the most powerful position I had held in a long time, because it allowed me to choose my next step without reacting to anyone else's. And as I returned to the kitchen, I poured myself a glass of water, took a slow sip, and looked again at the papers resting on the counter, at the numbers that represented more than just money. They represented independence, authority, choice, and I realized that whatever Chloe believed she had taken from me, she had miscalculated something fundamental. She had assumed that control came from proximity, from being present, from speaking the loudest, but real control, the kind Daniel had quietly ensured, does not announce itself. It waits, it observes, it moves when the moment is right. And as I stood there in that familiar kitchen, I made a decision, not to confront, not to explain, not yet, but to let her continue exactly as she was. Because sometimes the clearest truth is revealed not when you stop someone, but when you let them go just far enough to show you everything they were planning all along. That afternoon, I did something I had not done in years. I sat down at the kitchen table with a pen and a blank notepad, not because I needed to write anything urgent, but because I needed to think in a way that could not be interrupted. And there is something about putting thoughts into words that forces them to become clearer, more deliberate, and I began by writing a single question at the top of the page. What did Daniel prepare that I have not yet seen? And I let that question guide everything that followed. Because if what I had discovered at the bank was only part of the picture, then there were other parts, quieter ones, waiting to be understood, and I thought back to the small habits Daniel had developed over the last few years. The way he kept certain documents separate from the rest, the way he would occasionally step into his study and close the door, not out of secrecy, but out of focus, as if he was building something that required his full attention. And I stood up slowly, carrying that question with me as I walked down the hallway toward that same study, a room that had always felt like his space, organized in a way that made perfect sense to him and only gradually to anyone else. And when I opened the door, the familiar scent of paper and wood greeted me, unchanged, steady, and I moved toward the desk, running my hand lightly across the surface before opening the top drawer, not searching randomly, but following a memory. The way he used to place important things slightly out of sight, but never truly hidden. And there it was, a thin folder tucked beneath a stack of old receipts, labeled in his handwriting, simple, direct, my name, and I paused for a moment before picking it up, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition. Because this was not something left behind by accident. This was something left for me to find when I was ready to understand it. And as I opened the folder, I found documents I had never seen before. Copies of agreements, detailed outlines of account structures, notes written in the margins in Daniel's careful script, explaining not just what had been done, but why. And with each page, the picture became clearer, more complete, not dramatic, not shocking, but precise in a way that left no room for doubt. He had not just set up accounts, he had designed a system, one that ensured everything flowed through me. One that could not be redirected or accessed without my direct involvement. One that protected me not only from external risk, but from internal pressure. And I sat down in his chair, holding those papers in my hands, feeling the weight of what he had built not as a burden, but as a foundation. And for a moment I allowed myself to close my eyes, not in sadness, but in acknowledgement, because this was his way of speaking to me now, not with words, but with preparation. And when I opened my eyes again, I knew something had shifted permanently. not just in what I understood, but in how I would act. Because knowledge without action is only awareness, but knowledge applied carefully becomes direction. And I gathered the documents, placing them neatly back into the folder, not hiding them, but preserving them. And as I stood up, I could hear Chloe moving downstairs, her footsteps steady, unaware, and I realized that from this moment forward, every step I took would be intentional, not reactive, not emotional, but measured, because the situation had already changed, even if she did not yet see it. And the difference between us now was simple. She was acting on assumption, and I was acting on truth. I did not rush out of the study when I heard Chloe's footsteps reach the bottom of the stairs. I simply closed the drawer with the same quiet care I had opened it, placed the folder back exactly where it had been, and walked out as if I had been there for no particular reason at all. Because there is a difference between hiding something and choosing the right moment to reveal it, and I had already decided which one I was going to do. And when I stepped into the kitchen, Chloe was standing by the counter with her phone in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other, her posture relaxed, her expression composed, as though nothing had changed since the night before, and she glanced at me briefly, not with concern, not even with curiosity, but with a kind of distant acknowledgement, the way people look at something they believe they have already figured out, and she asked, in a tone that was almost casual, if I had thought about what she said, and I met her eyes for just a second before. Answering, my voice steady, measured, I said that I had, and that I would take care of things, and I watched the subtle shift in her shoulders, the small release of tension that told me she had expected compliance, that she had already moved on to the next step in whatever plan she had built in her mind. And I turned away without adding anything else, not offering details, not asking questions, because information, I was learning, is not always something you give. Sometimes it is something you hold, and the rest of the afternoon unfolded in a quiet rhythm that felt almost ordinary on the surface. But underneath, every movement carried intention, every observation added to a picture that was becoming clearer by the hour, and I noticed how Chloe moved through the house with a sense of ownership that had not been there before. The way she opened drawers without hesitation, the way she sorted through papers on the counter, occasionally glancing at her phone as if checking something against a list, and I said nothing. I simply watched, not with suspicion, but with attention, because attention reveals patterns, and patterns reveal purpose. And by early evening, I had seen enough to understand that this was not impulsive behavior. This was preparation, something she had been building toward for some time. And that realization did not upset me. It refined my thinking, because now I was not dealing with a sudden decision. I was dealing with a structured plan, and structured plans can be understood, anticipated, and, if necessary, redirected. And as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the living room floor, Chloe sat down at the dining table with her laptop, typing with the kind of focus that suggested she was organizing something important, and I took a seat across from her, not to interrupt, but to observe up close, and after a few minutes, she looked up, slightly surprised, as if she had not expected me to sit there at all, and she asked if there was something I needed, and I shook my head gently, telling her no, that I just wanted to sit for a while, and I could see the hesitation in her expression, the brief uncertainty that crossed her face before she returned to her screen. And in that moment, I understood something simple but critical. Her confidence depended on my silence being passive, on my presence being irrelevant, and the moment that shifted, even slightly, her certainty began to loosen, and I did not need to challenge her. I only needed to exist differently within the space she thought she controlled. And as I sat there in that quiet room, listening to the soft tapping of her keyboard, I realized that the balance had already begun to change. Not because I had said anything, not because I had revealed anything, but because I was no longer reacting to her decisions. I was allowing her to continue, knowing that every step she took without full understanding would bring her closer to a point she had not prepared for. And when that moment came, I would not need to raise my voice. I would only need to show her what had been there all along. The next morning began the same way as the one before, quiet, predictable on the surface, but beneath that calm there was a steady shift taking place, one that Chloe had not yet noticed, and I moved through the kitchen with the same measured pace, pouring coffee, setting a plate on the counter, allowing the routine to remain unchanged because consistency, I had learned, can be more disarming than confrontation. and when Chloe walked in, she barely looked at me, her attention already on her phone, her fingers moving quickly as she scrolled, her expression focused in a way that suggested she was expecting something, and I watched her for a moment before turning back to my cup, not intruding, not interrupting, just observing, because observation, when done carefully, reveals more than questions ever could, and it did not take long before I saw it, the subtle tightening in her posture, the slight pause in her movements, the way her brows drew together for just a second longer than before, and she tapped her screen again, slower this time, as if checking for a mistake, and then she stood up, walked to the counter where the mail had been sorted the day before, and began flipping through it with a little more urgency than necessary. And I remained exactly where I was, taking another sip of coffee, my gaze steady but not fixed, giving her space to move, to react, to show me what she had expected to find, and what she was beginning to realize was no longer there. And after a moment, she turned slightly toward me, her voice controlled but carrying a faint edge she could not quite hide, asking if I had touched any of the financial paperwork, and I shook my head gently, answering simply that I had only organized my things, nothing more, and I could see the hesitation in her eyes, the calculation, the quiet attempt to reconcile what she believed with what she was now experiencing, and she said nothing further, but the change was already there, small but undeniable, because certainty, once disrupted, does not return the same way. It fractures. It questions itself, and I knew that whatever she had been expecting to access, to control, to manage, was no longer aligning with the reality in front of her. And as the morning continued, those small disruptions began to stack, a call she stepped outside to take, her voice lower, more urgent, another glance at her phone, another attempt to check something that did not respond the way she anticipated, and I did not interfere. I did not ask what was wrong. I did not offer help, because help implies authority, and authority was exactly what she was beginning to lose. And by late morning, the quiet confidence she had carried so easily the day before had shifted into something else, something tighter, more controlled, and when she finally sat down across from me at the table, her posture straight, her expression composed but no longer relaxed, she asked again, more directly this time, if I had made any changes, and I met her gaze without hesitation, my voice calm. Even, I told her that I had simply reviewed what belonged to me, and left it at that, because the truth, when delivered without explanation, has a way of settling deeper than any argument, and I watched as she absorbed those words, not fully understanding them yet, but sensing that something fundamental had moved beyond her reach, and in that moment, I realized that the balance had shifted completely, not in a way that required announcement, not in a way that demanded recognition, but in a way that would continue to unfold, quietly, steadily, until there was nothing left for her to assume, only what she could finally see. By the afternoon, the tension in the house had settled into something sharper, no longer hidden beneath routine, no longer softened by assumption, and Chloe was no longer pretending that everything was under control, her movements quicker now, less measured, the quiet confidence she once carried replaced by a careful urgency she could not fully conceal, and I watched as she paced between the kitchen and the living room, her phone pressed to her ear, her voice low but strained in a way that suggested she was asking questions she did not have answers to. And I remained seated at the table, my hands folded lightly in front of me, not as a gesture of waiting, but as a position of stillness, because stillness, I had come to understand, can hold more authority than movement. And when she finally ended the call, she stood there for a moment, looking at me in a way she had not before, not dismissive, not distant, but searching, as if trying to reconcile the version of me she believed existed with the one now sitting across from her. And she asked, directly this time, what exactly I had done, and I met her gaze without hesitation, not with defiance, not with anger, but with clarity, and I told her that I had not done anything new. I had only stepped into what was already mine, and the words settled between us in a silence that felt heavier than anything she had said the night before, because there was no accusation in them, no explanation, only fact, and facts, when they are simple and complete, leave very little room for interpretation, and I saw it then, the moment her certainty broke completely, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, like something internal giving way under pressure it could no longer hold. And she pulled out a chair and sat down slowly, her posture no longer composed, her hands resting on the table as if grounding herself in something she could understand. And she asked again, softer this time, what I meant. And I reached into my purse, taking out the papers I had carried since the bank, placing them carefully on the table between us, not pushing them toward her, not presenting them as evidence, but simply setting them there, allowing them to exist in the space without commentary. And she looked down at them, her eyes moving across the pages, scanning, searching, and I watched as realization began to take shape in her expression, piece by piece, line by line, until she leaned back slightly, her breath catching in a way that was almost imperceptible. And in that moment, I did not feel satisfaction, I did not feel the need to say anything more, because the truth had already done what it needed to do. It had shifted the balance completely, and as she sat there, processing what she had not expected to find, I stood up slowly, not to leave, but to move, to reclaim the space I had never truly lost. And I walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street beyond, the same street that had seemed so unchanged just a day before. And I realized that nothing outside had shifted at all, only the position within it had. And behind me, I could hear the faint sound of paper being turned, of understanding settling in where assumption once stood. And I knew then that whatever came next would not be decided by words spoken in frustration or control. It would be decided by what had already been established, carefully, quietly, long before either of us had realized its full meaning. And I did not need to claim anything. I only needed to stand in it, because sometimes the most powerful response is not to argue, not to explain, but to simply reveal what has been true all along.